place after Russia invaded Ukraine. Putin spoke from the Black Sea resort town of Sochi Monday after meeting with the Turkish president, Tayyip Erdogan.
As I've said repeatedly, we were simply forced to make this decision since Western countries have blocked and continue to block the implementation of the grain deal in terms of ensuring the access of Russian agricultural producers to the world markets. That is, they refuse to lift the sanctions on the export of our grain and fertilizers.
U.S. officials say North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will soon travel to Russia for talks with President Putin. The two leaders are expected to discuss an arms deal that would see North Korea provide artillery ammunition to Russia for its war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Financial Times reports lenders of 4 of China's biggest banks have stepped in to extend billions of dollars to Russian banks that have faced sanctions since Russia invaded Ukraine. The UN Refugee Agency is warning as many as 1.8 million people will flee Sudan by the end of the year as fighting continues between rival military factions. The UN estimates the conflict has already displaced about 1 million people. Another 800,000 are expected to leave Sudan in the coming months. Meanwhile, Doctors Without Borders is reporting Sudanese refugees arriving in South Sudan are suffering from an alarming rise of measles and malnutrition. In the Sudanese capital of Khartoum, many residents say they cannot afford basic necessities, including bread.
Bread is available, but people cannot buy it. The loaf of bread costs 70 Sudanese pounds or 12 US cents. People cannot afford it. This price is too high for them.
In Gabon, the leader of last week's military coup has been sworn in as interim president. During a ceremony Monday, General Brice Oligui Nguema promised, quote, free, transparent, and credible elections to restore civilian rule, but gave no timeline for elections. The military coup ousted President Ali Bongo, whose family had ruled the oil-rich nation since 1967. Oligui is a cousin of the ousted president and the former head of Gabon's presidential guard. Meanwhile, in Niger, tens of thousands of protesters rallied Saturday outside a French military base demanding French troops leave Niger. Tension has been escalating between Niger and its former colonial ruler since a military coup in Niger in late July. Niger's new military leaders have ordered French troops and France's ambassador to leave the country, but France has ignored the requests. Protesters in Niger Saturday called on the French to leave them alone.
People say, oh no, people get paid to go out and protest. That's a thing of the past. It's the people of Niger who are out here. You'd have to be blind not to see it. We're fed up. We want to be responsible for ourselves. People think we're babies. Leave us alone. Is that too much to ask?
Chinese President Xi Jinping will skip the G20 summit when it convenes in India next weekend. On Monday, China's foreign ministry said Premier Li Qiang will instead lead China's delegation to talks in Delhi. This comes amidst a worsening border dispute between China and India, with thousands of troops deployed to a disputed region of the Himalayas. A major new report backed by the United Nations finds invasive species are spreading around the world at an unprecedented rate, driving extinctions, transmitting diseases, and threatening food supplies for millions of people. Ecologist Helen Roy, who co-authored the report by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, says more than 3,500 harmful invasive species are seriously threatening nature while causing untold economic damage to humans.
Of those costs that are tangible that we've been able to gather together, we can see it's $423 billion annually. But we also know that looking back, then these figures have been quadrupling every 10 years. And we have no reason to think that that isn't going to be happening into the future.
The first Africa Climate Summit opened Monday in Nairobi. U.S. climate envoy John Kerry pushed for the establishment of a carbon market, but many African climate justice activists pushed back against the idea. Ahead of the summit, Oxfam slammed wealthy nations for delivering a, quote, pittance to help East Africa confront the climate crisis. According to Oxfam, over 31 million people are currently facing acute hunger across Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and South Sudan, due in part to the climate crisis, which has disproportionately impacted the region. In Spain, at least 3 people were killed, 3 others are missing as unprecedented rainfall inundated Madrid and other cities Monday. Flooding swept away bridges, halted commuter rail traffic. In Greece, where authorities have finally brought unprecedented wildfires under control, at least 1 person's dead, another missing after intense rainstorm battered mountain towns. Forecasters say some parts of central Greece could see over a foot of rain in just 24 hours. That's nearly double the annual average rainfall totals for the capital, Athens. Here in the United States, a scorching summer heat wave brought record temperatures to central and eastern states Labor Day. Parts of Wisconsin and Minnesota suffered triple-digit heat Monday, the unofficial last day of summer. In Minnesota, guards ordered a lockdown of the Stillwater Men's Prison Sunday after prisoners refused to return to their cells to protest dangerous conditions. Advocates say some 1,200 prisoners spent the holiday weekend with no access to showers or ice and limited time for recreation due to understaffing. Temperatures outside the prison, much of which lacks air conditioning, approached 100 degrees Fahrenheit Sunday and Monday. In Nevada, tens of thousands of participants at the annual Burning Man Festival were left stranded over the weekend after torrential rainfall covered normally dry campgrounds in mud and made roads impassable. Attendees had been told to shelter in place since Friday. The extreme weather capped a Burning Man festival that proceeded despite the objections of climate activists who on August 27th peacefully blockaded a 2-lane highway leading to the campgrounds to demand Burning Man ban private jets, single-use plastic, and unlimited use of generators and propane tanks. That protest was broken up by a Nevada tribal police officer who rammed into their blockade, injuring a protester before drawing a pistol, tackling a demonstrator, and threatening to shoot activists.
Oh, what happened?
In a statement, the Seven Circles Alliance activist group, which organized the protest, responded, quote, "The excessive response is a snapshot of the institutional violence and police brutality that's being shown to anyone who's actively working to bring about systemic change within the United States, including the climate movement," unquote. Burning Man organizers estimate the festival's carbon footprint at about 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year, equivalent to Guatemala. And if you expect, it is expected that the elite will seek further recounts, annulment, that this runoff will happen on August 20th.
Yes, of course, we were surprised by the results, but it was logical that all these elites and this corruption regime were going to give fight against us, because this review of the ballots, it was just an excuse because they were saying that we manipulated the results in order to commit fraud. But it was impossible for us to do that because we have no economic resources. We didn't have candidates all over the country, and we are relatively a new political party. So it was really difficult for us to compete in this election, and now they are saying that we manipulated the results. So it was game-changing for Guatemala.
Nobody wants to help him. I told him, I said, don't keep saying
This
that.
is the first time that this happened.
I said, you were supposed to go
So can you
to
talk
one
about
hospital
what Samia
the day
represents
before
and
yesterday
what it
with
would
Jacob.
mean if
Jacob
Bernardo
came at 6
Arevalo
o'clock.
became president
How
of
can I
Guatemala,
remove this one,
what
darling?
he ran on his platform?
What is that?
This.
Well, we are a social democratic party, but we have some priorities that maybe that scares some political elites or economic elites. We have some priorities
I have to
that will
bring
take
the
us
chair here, yeah?
sometime
You
to
say?
solve here in Guatemala, because we have this democracy. It isn't at its best. The first thing is that we're going to fight against corruption, and that means a big administrative reform of the state. The second thing is having a market that works for all. So we plan to pass the first antitrust legislation in the history of Guatemala. And that is breaking all these market concentration monopolies and everything and market imperfections. So that is maybe most scary things for economic elites here in
Hello
Guatemala.
guys, thank you,
The third
thank
thing
you.
is a massive
Pasensya na
investment in
po.
health, in education,
Wala.
social security, and public service.
From down, no thanks.
Can you talk about the history of U.S. intervention and how that has led to where we are today? We were just mentioning that Bernardo Arevaló's father, Juan José Arevalo, first democratically elected president of Guatemala, from 45 to 51 in 1954. The U.S. Backing United Fruit
Oras lang po tayo
overthrew
guys.
the Guatemalan
Ay,
president,
sibagsak na po yung oras
leading
ng
to a
aking
number of military regimes, the massacres of people, particularly indigenous in the northwest highlands of Guatemala, and how that has brought us to today, to Giammattei, the current president, who we just heard Bernardo Arévalo talking about the authoritarian government, and what you think needs to change, in particular, what should the U.S. be doing, what role the U.S. should be playing.
Well, yes, it is important for us because Juan José Arevalo was the first democratically elected president here in Guatemala. He won against a regime of military dictatorships, and now Bernardo will win against a regime of corruption dictatorship. I think that we have historical justice and Guatemalan people on our side, and we know that we have a social democratic legacy, but we're now looking forward, and we're expecting to have a pacific but strong government against corruption and authoritarian ways. But we know that we have now a polarized society, and it is time to put an end to that.
And can you talk about Giammattei when it comes to corruption? I mean, when you have what is known as the Pactos Corruptos, the political and business ruling elite in Guatemala, how they banned presidential candidates. It seems like they didn't bother to ban Bernardo Arévalo because they never realized he would come in second, leading to this runoff against the former First Lady Sandra Torres.
Well, actually, I'm not sure if Giammattei's presidency is the most corrupt president in history, but it sure is the most shameless. They have no legitimacy, no social nor economic results for the people, not even the intention to solve them some minor problem. So it's all.
There's a place at the bottom where you can click it and then you can type something in the search ring. It's not there now, is it?
Protecting their judges. CENIA arises actually from a way of protest against corruption and all the authoritarian ways. We have been speaking up in Congress against this political persecution, and we have been victims in the past also, and in favor of freedom of speech and many other human rights. So it's very important for us, this election.
Can I ask you about the attacks on activists, on opposition, also on the press, the El Periódico, the founder, Jose Rubén Zamora, just sentenced to 6 years in prison, and what this means, the Guatemalan court in June convicting him of money laundering in what rights groups have condemned as a trumped-up case, part of a crackdown on press freedom. Zamora, founder and president of this investigative journalism website.
Yes, it is because this regime is not only corrupt but authoritarian. So it's not the first symptom of this authoritarian regime getting to power, because we have no freedom of speech. They like buy all these congressmen and congresswomen in Congress. So there is no like Republican balances, check and balances here in Guatemala. So it is not only political saying that we are living in a corruption dictatorship. So we have to put an end to that, because we have a really polarized society, and it is because of political decisions.
And can you talk about how corruption and this authoritarianism leads to greater migration, and the role of the U.S. when it comes to shoring up the Guatemalan government in exchange for stopping that migration?
Well, actually, some of the consequences of this corruption elite leading the country is that they do not have any plan for anything but for stealing public money. So the economic strategy is not working for anyone here in Guatemala. So the consequences are migration, but also the increases of violence, of inequality, of poverty. So every time we measure poverty, it's every time higher. And that is also political decisions. So that is why they have no legitimacy in power. So they might have the constitutional court, the electoral authority, the Congress, the executive power, but they do not have the most important majority, which is the people's majority.
And there have been protests around the political and government elite trying to head off this runoff, stop Arevalo from running. Are you concerned about them initiating street violence?
The street violence.
Violence in the streets.
Yes, well, maybe, because I'm not sure if they are going to win this one, because people are not supporting. Actually, I think the review of these ballots, it was their second plan, their secondary plan. If it had came out for them, everything will be different now, but it was a big failure for them. It was, I would say, humiliating for them, because in the public eye, with all the media watching and our brave teams fighting for a fair review, we ended up having more votes than we were like originally announced, and it wasn't a lot, but a couple of thousand of votes that they take it wrong. So we are now stronger than ever. So I'm not sure if they're going to be like stopping Bernardo for running for the second round.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We look now at how the internationally renowned Guatemalan journalist, Jose Ruben Zamora, faces 40 years in prison at his verdict and sentencing hearing Wednesday in Guatemala City, after he was arrested in what press freedom and human rights groups say are trumped-up money laundering charges. Zamora is the founder and president of the independent investigative Guatemalan newspaper, El Periódico, and for decades has reported on government corruption. International rights groups and the Guatemalan Association of Journalists say the case against him is politically motivated. This is Jose Ruben Zamora speaking after his arrest last July. He's been in prison since.
They chased me and my children in the streets in a very dangerous way. My family had to go into exile. My home was illegally raided, but they haven't gone as far as now with them formally arresting me. I don't know how long the process will take. This is a narco-klepto dictatorship. 4 years ago, our apparent democracy was transformed, electing a president that is a thief who has been assaulting us for the past 4 years. Us, as Guatemalans, we don't have the capacity to defend ourselves.
After Zamora's detention, El Periódico was forced to stop publication of its print edition. The newspaper then shuttered its online version, May 15th, due to what the paper called judicial and financial harassment from the right-wing government of the Guatemalan president, Alejandro Giammattei. It signed off with a single headline in Spanish that translated to, "We say no to power, 1996 to 2023. It had been publishing for 27 years. Rights groups say Zamora has not received a fair trial under Guatemala's Attorney General Maria Consuelo Porras, who is on a U.S. State Department list of corrupt and undemocratic actors.
Low fat.
And sentencing tomorrow. We're joined in Miami by his son, Jose Carlos Zamora, who is also a journalist. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, though, under these very difficult circumstances. Tell us what happened listen to your father and what this sentencing means tomorrow in Guatemala City.
Hi, Amy. Good morning, Juan, and thank you for having me and for paying attention to what's happening in Guatemala. Well, what happened is my father has over a 30-year trajectory in doing investigative journalism in Guatemala. At El Periódico with his team, he has been doing it for 26 years, specifically in the government of Alejandro Yamatei. In the first 144 weeks of the administration, he and his team published 144 stories and investigations into corruption around Yamatei. This led to this political persecution. In Guatemala, there is a democratic facade, but the executive controls the judiciary. And they are using criminal law to persecute anybody who they consider a critical voice. The Yamatei administration has been systematically attacking all democratic institutions and persecuting anybody who had anything to do with fighting corruption, including the highest profile judges, prosecutors, activists, and in the case of my father, journalists. As you were saying, it's incredible that the public ministry requested a 40-year sentence, which is historically there hasn't been such a request for these types of cases. So it's really shameful and ridiculous. And it really shows clearly that it's a political persecution. And when they arrested him and processed him, and with this sentence, what they want to send is a very clear message to all journalists in Guatemala that in the country doing journalism is a crime.
Jose Carlos, could you talk to, for those who are not familiar with the most recent history in Guatemala after the peace accords, and it looked like Central America was heading in a better direction, and even the perpetrators of some of the genocide were tried. What has happened in recent years that allowed this resurgence of this right-wing government in your country?
Well, since '85, we started our new democratic era. We had the opportunity to start with a clean slate, but every 4 years we change government, and every government has been very corrupt. But in the last 10 years, there was a big effort to fight corruption, and it was working. And when they saw these different groups that are involved in corruption saw that it was working, they all became allies, dismantled that effort, and not only they dismantled it, but they started persecuting anybody who was involved in fighting corruption. And that's exactly what is happening now. And what you see is not only that they are persecuting anybody who was involved in fighting corruption, but now people who were involved in the highest profile corruption cases and also human rights abuses during the war, they are being let free. So you see a regression and a lot of repression. This administration, the Yamatei administration, has not only been corrupt, but extremely repressive. There's never been since 1985, there have never been so many Guatemalans in exile fleeing political persecution, from judges to prosecutors to journalists. The official number is around 40, but it's estimated that it's around 80 people who are left the country because they were being politically persecuted, and the ones that didn't leave are in prison and facing these ridiculous processes. Like in the case of my father, not only was his case fabricated, but he has been made go through a process that has been an absolute, total violation of due process. And now he's facing this sentence. We really expect him to be convicted because the system is corrupt. And really what we're seeing is that the government of Alejandro Yamatei has him as a hostage.
If you can talk, Jose Carlos Zamora, about the past threats against your father. There's been assassination threats, death threats, kidnapping threats, but what it means that they bring charges of money laundering against him now. And ultimately, what we're talking about is this coming together of the elite and the governing elite, Yamate, the Pacto de Corruptos, I think they are referred to in Guatemala.
Yes, correct. It's the use of the law to persecute critical voices and journalists and opposition. It's really damaging to democracy and to the country, and that's what we're seeing. Before, when it came to journalists, and for example, what you were mentioning about my father, throughout his 30-year career, he has been shot at, kidnapped. The entire family has been attacked and kidnapped. He has been, they attempted to assassinate him in 2008. There's been car bombs. Everything you can imagine has happened. But what we see is an evolution in how the government has become more sophisticated in attacking journalists. And this also comes from all other repressive regimes. They copy each other, from the Philippines to Venezuela to Nicaragua to Guatemala. Before, they would do two things: attack a journalist's credibility, because they know that's the only asset a journalist has, and from the other side, they would do these death threats and assassination attempts. But then they discover that killing journalists comes at a very high price. So when you control the law and the judiciary, it's much simpler to use the law to persecute anybody who you consider opposition. And that's what they are doing. In case of they started first with civil law, with these SLAPS lawsuits, but then they saw an even more efficient tool in criminal, because that allows them to have these trumped-up charges on money laundering, and that allows them to have an arrest warrant to arrest a journalist and place him in jail, and it really changes everything, and it allows them to say, under this democratic facade, that it's not about journalism, that it's not about press freedom, but it's about a criminal. So it allows them to continue to attack the credibility of a journalist, but it also allows them to neutralize him if you put them in prison. So it's a very clear message to all other journalists in the country that they can come after anybody who continues to denounce corruption.
And Jose Carlos, how is your father doing in prison? Where's he being held? What are the conditions of his detention? And have you spoken to him recently?
He's in a prison that is a military base. He's healthy, he's in good spirits, but he's been 319 days in prison today, in what pretty much is solitary confinement. So he spends 23 hours a day in solitary in a very small cell that is in very bad shape. So the conditions aren't very good, because the government really had three objectives when they arrested him. One was to punish him directly. He's a pain for them. He has denounced all of their corrupt acts. So they really wanted to punish him directly, and that's why they have him in such bad conditions in this tiny cell. The second was to shut down the newspaper, which they finally managed to do 11 months later. Because they also started harassing and attacking advertisers. And the third point was to send this really clear message to all journalists in the country that in Guatemala, doing journalism is a crime.
Jose Carlos, we just have about a minute, but what can the Biden administration do? I mean, you have these deals being made, especially with Northern Triangle countries, where the U.S. shores them up to stop immigration. Can you talk about that?
I think there need to be two things. One is harder sanctions that really have a teeth, right? Like that's one thing. But from the other side, they should stop having these collaborations with them and just with the focus on migration, because it's very nearsighted. Because the true and the root cause of migration is corruption. It's corruption and repression and violence. And that's really what's driving migration. And until that root cause isn't addressed, people won't stop migrating. So you definitely can fund a military police that tries to stop people south of the border. But unless these root causes are addressed, people won't stop coming to the U.S.
Jose Carlos Zamora, we thank you so much for being with us. Guatemalan journalist based in Miami, the son of the internationally renowned Guatemalan journalist Jose Ruben Zamora, who faces 40 years in prison at his sentencing on Wednesday after being jailed for nearly a year on what press freedom and human rights groups say are trumped-up money laundering charges as political retaliation over exposés of government corruption in Guatemala. Jose Ruben Zamora is 66 years old. Word on what happens tomorrow in the courtroom in Guatemala City. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Taracena, Tammy Warnoff, Trina Nadora, Sam Alcock, Tamer Astudillo, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud, and Sandra Lopez. Our executive director is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, John Randolph, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan, David Brew, and Dennis McCormick. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Before drawing a pistol, tackling a demonstrator, and threatening to shoot activists. In a statement, the circle
witch hunts, and then moved on from that in the 1960s to harass the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And so he had this long history of constant harassment of anyone who opposed him or opposed the status quo in the United States. And he did it in a way that he had intimidated everyone in Congress who believed that he had blackmail material on them. Whether he did or not, they all believed it. And so no one was willing to take him on until, or even investigate the FBI in any meaningful way until he was dead. One of the really interesting things that I learned was the famous burglary of the FBI office in Medea, Pennsylvania, I think in 1971, where the burglars, who were basically anti-war dissidents, took a bunch of documents and then began to understand what they were looking at only after they had taken the documents, and they started parceling them out to members of Congress and journalists who they thought would be helpful in disclosing and airing the information that they were providing to them. And they were sending it to them anonymously, and they were sending to very liberal members of Congress. And one of the things that I learned that was shocking was that those members of Congress immediately turned them back to the FBI without doing anything with them. And some of the journalists they sent them to did the same thing. And it just showed how powerful the hold J. Edgar Hoover had on people, because he was still alive at that time.
Guys, thank you.
And your review and reporting on several of the major assassination attempts that government agencies, especially the CIA, were involved in. You spent a lot of time talking back about the key mafia figures, Johnny Roselli, a mobster from California, and Sam Giancana, another mobster, a key mobster from Chicago. They were both assassinated, one after testifying before the Church Commission, and the other one just before he was about to testify before the Church Committee. Could you, for those, especially for younger listeners and viewers who are not aware of this whole issue of what happened with attempt to kill Castro and the Kennedy assassination, could you go through some of that?
Yeah. At the end of the Eisenhower administration, the CIA decided, Dwight Eisenhower was very interested, was pushing the CIA to try to kill Castro. And the CIA decided that one way they could do it is to form a secret alliance with the mafia. And so they arranged for a former FBI agent named Bob Mayhew, who was also on contract with the CIA, to contact mobsters around the country to see if they would form an alliance to work with the CIA to get into to Cuba and kill Castro. And so he first contacted Johnny Rosselli, who was a flamboyant mobster, operating both in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. And Rosselli then contacted Sam Giancana, who was the boss of the Chicago mob. And the two of them then contacted Santo Traficante, who was the mob boss of Florida and who had long-time casino operations in Cuba before Castro took over. And so they went with Mayhew to Miami Beach and set up a shop in the Fontainebleau Hotel to try to figure out how to get poisons to somebody close to Castro who could kill him. But the plot kind of unraveled very quickly because Giancana had a girlfriend in Las Vegas. Phyllis McGuire, one of the famous McGuire sisters, was singing that. And he was convinced that she was sleeping with a stand-up comedian named Dan Rowan, who later became famous in the Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In show in the late 60s. And so he wanted to leave and go back to Las Vegas and maybe kill Dan Rowan. Get poisons to some...
Can I ask you about the attacks on activists, on opposition, also on the press, the El Periódico, the founder of Against Mora just sentenced to 6 years in prison, and what this means, the Guatemalan court in June convicting him of money laundering and what rights groups have condemned as a trumped-up case, part of a crackdown on press freedom. Zamora, founder and president of this investigative journalism website.
Yes, it is, because this regime is not only corrupt, but authoritarian. So it's another symptom of this authoritarian regime and getting to power, because we have no freedom of speech, so they like this whole list.
Do you have the mixtapes?
I've seen it somewhere.
Greater migration
مبروك كبرتي.
كانوا يقولوا لي الحين انت كبيرة انت بالغة. خليك بنت، لا تقصين شعرك، الشعر طويل أحلى، اجلسي زي البنت، ليش ما تتنكدي؟ طولي أظافرك، لا تخلينها قصيرة، ليش ما تلبسين كعب؟ دائما يجيني كلام من عماتي وجدتي، حاولي تلبسين الأشياء الثوية. عشان يشوفونه أني عظمة.
I got issue ليش انت كذا؟ في شيء مريحة فيه، الحين انت كبيرة انت بالغة.
حاولي تلبسين الأشياء الثوية.
ليش ما تتنكدي؟ ليش ما تلبسين كعب؟
أثر فيني الموضوع.
مبروك كبرتي. مبروك كبرتي.